Hi, welcome to Connecting the Dots, the podcast where we share our stories from the battlefield of consulting. I'm your host, Johnny Hill.
Hi, I'm Ted Wilmus.
I'm Thomas Yarnall.
Hi, I'm Andy Nichols.
I'm Pamela Crozier.
Hey, I'm Kareem Jamal.
Today we're talking all about what you can do when you get dropped into the middle of a chaotic or dysfunctional project, and how you can help to get it back on track. Let's get started. So let's start off by just talking a little bit about what we mean by dysfunctional projects. Obviously, there's a wide spectrum of different kinds of projects that may have different issues with communication or organization, but let's spend a little bit of time talking about kind of what we mean when we're talking about dysfunctional projects.
When I think of dysfunctional projects, I think of something that's like already gone off the rails, meaning you might not have enough resources. People might not be mapping back to the original requirements. You might have a stakeholder that has left the company. So there's all facets of dysfunctional projects. I think that when you're jumping in to some of those dysfunctional projects, it's like sit down, take stock of the situation. That's the first step. But taking stock of that situation, understanding what the goals are, what the scope is, what the current state really is, like current state of affairs, talk to everybody on the team and see where you're starting. For me, that's what happens when I jump into those type of projects. You know, you can jump in the beginning and the end, there's any level of dysfunction that can happen. Ideally, if you start with the plan and goals, you'll be further down the path.
I think another form of dysfunctional project, that kind of just building upon what Pam said, was, where there isn't just kind of a single vision that the team's working towards.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have many different threads kind of going on all at once, but they're not actually converging on any shared vision. There can be many different reasons for that. And we see many different reasons for that, but that's a pretty common thing, is where everybody isn't on the same page.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. When you've joined something and it's obvious that there's no shared goal or well-defined goal or solution or delivery that's been accepted across the team and everyone's working to the same objective. That's one of the biggest dysfunctional things that I've found across many projects.
Or too many goals, right? That
Right.
end up being conflicting. And then you don't know which one to follow.
Interpretation, of the same thing. Yeah.
That lack of alignment from the beginning. And I think that's where, like, we try to make sure, even before you start those projects, meeting internally with the teams and having, some people call it a charter, some people call it agreement, a working plan or working agreement, making sure that that's set up from the beginning. When you're talking about this topic of dysfunctional projects, that's not always the case, and you're having to go and backtrack. So you're adding more of that work onto it to make sure that you have the goal and the alignment. And I think one of the biggest problems is that lack of, like, the requirements, and everybody has that different idea of the requirements. Like, is it a tool? Is it a dashboard? That type of thing. It's that making sure that you can get everybody together and sign off on those agreements up front is really important.
Yeah, I always like our transition, when we move out of, everything, all the paperwork signed, we're now moving ahead with a project. That first step we take, where we have what we call a kickoff, and you've got, the team that you're going to be working with within the client, our own internal team, and you walk through the statement of work or the contract itself and actually validate that everybody understands what the intent of the document was and what the objectives are. I think that's always a really good starting point. And I've found, when that hasn't happened, the ability for the project to kind of start to go into dysfunction is greatly increased. When you've actually sat down and talked through, you can catch anomalies and disagreements very early on and address those. So I always think that's a great step in our process.
When we're talking about dysfunction, I'd be curious, like, Thomas, you had some good examples of what happens when you come in as a tech lead and things are all over the board. Like, how do you jump in and wrangle it? What do you do? Where do you start? When it's just, how do you break down everything and throw all the spreadsheets out the window and start fresh almost?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of the things that you need to do, there's a lot of overlap with what you do as a tech lead and what you do as a project manager in terms of just getting in, talking to everybody, understanding the context, trying to understand the history of why certain decisions were made. I've probably mentioned this before, but one of my favorite quotes is things are the way they are because they got that way. And it's understanding why did things get here. Natural desire is to want to change things, but you need to understand why are things how they are now, and to understand where things are intentionally working this way and where things are dysfunctional because they haven't received enough attention yet.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting those things can creep in at any time. And that's why it's helpful to have documentation or a unified vision that you can go back to that's actually written down instead of like, oh yeah, 6 months ago, we all talked about it. And hopefully we're all on the same page 6 months later when new people are joining the project or people are shuffling around or a new investor gets involved or whatever it may be. Like those complications and other good ideas, legitimate ideas that might challenge the overall direction or create that dysfunction, even if they are like beneficial, just not timed right or not communicated right, like those can get introduced at any point. So having that source of truth, I think, is also a big part of it.
I think, Johnny, you bring up a good point that people, I think, get a little nervous about. You use the word documentation. People think of documentation and they're like, that's like, documents and documents and documents. But really, it's just like, write it down. Write down that goal. Write down like what the latest change was. Particularly comes in with like scope creep and things like that. Like, make sure that you understand what that goal was that you wrote down and what that requirement is. So if someone mentions, oh, we want a widget instead of an application, that type of thing, that is, you're writing it down, you're saving it later. You're saving a lot of work later. And it doesn't have to be an 18-page document. It can be quick update on a Confluence page with a comment. And that's what we've been trying to do more and more is across our projects. It's making sure that there's comments on the page or that you've updated a ticket or things like that don't take a lot of time, or add it to a Slack update. Just write it down.
A real practical thing, there's a lot of templates out there on Confluence and other places that you can find to help get past that initial staring at a blank page, knowing you need to document something, but what's it look like? And you can take those and make them yours. Do whatever you need to with it to find out what works for your team and your project.
Doesn't have to be anything fancy either. Just note it so that it's there for future, recollection. Because oftentimes when we're in the thick of it, things just get so chaotic. Sometimes you just have to stop and breathe for a second, right? Because with everything swirling, it's like, cloudy with a chance of meatballs and confusion, right? And so you need to sort of uncloud all of it and almost get out of your skin and come back with another clear, blank perspective to identify, where are the problems coming from? What's the real reason? The confusion or the lack of clarity or things that are happening that seem to be causing this problem. Because with a clear sort of mindset, you can often quickly identify what the sources of the problem are. Is it requirements? Is it too few managers? Is it too many managers? Right? Is it constant distractions and change of course?
Yeah, I've a few times used the term baselining, which I know is not the correct term, but just calling time out. Hang on a second, let's stop. Let's talk about where we are. Let's look at what we've still got to get done, put it into, priority order, understand what the effort is against it and whether we still have the budget to do it. Actually just taking that time to reset everybody's expectations is also a great way of trying to get back under control. Doesn't always work. A recent project that I've been on with some people, we've baselined now about 5 times, and we, it works for a short period of time, but then the communication problems start and the misunderstandings, or people get redirected to other priorities, and we're back in that dysfunctional method again. So using that is a very, very positive tool sometimes.
Yeah, it really helps to go back to what are the requirements? Let's restrain our scope so that we don't try to build the world here and get back to what is our task at hand? What are the business goals that we need to achieve here? What are the real parameters that we're operating in? And every time that we've done that, that's really helped to constrain and define the work that we have at hand.
Right. And even in those situations, you're not even necessarily saying no to the other ideas. It's more of a let's gather around and make sure we're all on the same page in terms of priority. And like we were saying earlier, you can still write down the other ideas that come up or the other directions that are mentioned and say, okay, we can revisit that, but let's remember this is the priority.
Right. You're consistently building that backlog.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that you touched on, Andy, was making sure that you have the right resource allocation, you have the right people on the team, because that can also lead to chaos. Not that they're not doing a good job, but they might be mismatched for that particular project at hand and better somewhere else. So we also have to make sure that we have the right people on these projects. And if we need to make a change, that we've communicated it clearly. We're adaptable, we're kind, we're making sure that people understand the reason for moves. We've run into that a couple of times. And then just making sure that you're responsive and that you're working as a team to get through that chaos.
Yeah, I think sometimes for me, it's helpful to think about, rarely is a project entirely dysfunctional. Sometimes
Right.
it is, but most of the time it's not. And so thinking about how you can kind of firewall off that source of dysfunction as much as possible and kind of create, from a software development kind of standpoint, almost like an integration point between the dysfunction and the functional part. And do your best to not fall back into bad habits because of the dysfunction, because it's easy to make excuses just when you're in a chaotic environment because everything's crazy and everything's dysfunctional. So it's helpful for me at least to kind of try to figure out where that handoff should be, where you can do almost kind of like some cleanup, and then ideally behind that handoff point, from that part of this team standpoint, it should not be a dysfunctional project. That's hard to do that, but at a minimum, it should be a less dysfunctional project than the rest of it. So I think trying to think how you can really control at least the pieces you have control over and identify those is pretty important.
And I think what you said, Ted, really makes sense, because all dysfunction is not the same, right? You have to define the dysfunction. A dysfunction for a startup is very different than a large, well-established monolith, right? Startups are really working in a lot of dysfunction by design, because that's just how they are. So there's a higher appetite for that. And then, what one person might define as dysfunction, another may not. So it's also a personality type thing, right? So it's really important to define it, write it down, again, document it. And then we can collectively decide, hey, is this really dysfunction, or is it just, some early stage discovery, or is it, what have you, right? There can be different things that someone might be blowing out of proportion, whereas others feel there's no need to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's a good point.
The levels of dysfunction, Kareem.
Just make a chart.
I mean, and I wouldn't say it's rare, right, that there's a lot of dysfunctional projects. Most of ours run pretty smoothly, but I would think that, every once in a while you get one of those that's just, you have to stop and wrap your arms around it and say, how are we going to get over this quick hump?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to conflict in projects. There's going to be some level of miscommunication or misunderstanding or dysfunction, and that can either be seen as a threat or as an opportunity to say, okay, we need to pause. We need to take this opportunity to get on the same page. And then from there, make improvements and make everything hopefully go more smoothly. There's always potential for that to blow up in your face, I suppose. But I think when you frame it as an opportunity rather than a threat, it can kind of help bring everyone's temperature down a little bit. Because when you say dysfunction, people can get kind of tense,
Right.
Oh, are you accusing me of causing, whatever it is. It kind of goes hand in hand with conflict in projects. But I think the way you frame it and approach it can make all the difference.
And I mean, it's looking at risk mitigation, right? Risk management.
It's also okay to step outside of just the project as well. When you see some recent instances, we saw some organizational dysfunction and communication issues, and it's okay to bring suggestions to the table to create new processes and apply those processes. an offer to own those processes and monitor and track and keep people, educate people into that. A lot of startup companies bring, great skills to the table, but not necessarily the experience in software design and implementation that we're familiar with. So there's also great opportunity to help companies in terms of building process and standards and best practices.
Yeah, I think it's important not to be too proprietary about what your, job title is. Like, oh, I'm a senior software developer. That's all I do. Like,
Yeah.
Great. That's awesome. But there's, like Andy says, lots of opportunity to fill in the gaps that perhaps the customer doesn't have a skill set for. So I think one of the things we're particularly good at is approaching things from more of a generalist perspective, and folks are generally very interested in learning more about the subject area that they're working in, et cetera, not just purely heads down on engineering work, even though that is a big part of it.
It is a good opportunity to show your chops, right? Like, hey, we can manage dysfunction and still get around it. And, we're experienced and we know how to navigate around these types of things. So you can also look at it as an opportunity, right? And I'll make a controversial statement where it's like, I'd say a little bit of dysfunction is probably a good thing, right? It adds a little bit of excitement instead of just, completely just boring, right? A movie without an antagonist is not that great. Everyone's living in a neighborhood. They're all peaceful. Everyone's happy. The end. Okay, great. Right. That's so sometimes some ups and downs just keep you on your toes too, right? So as we said, it gives you opportunities to upskill and get better at things in your role and introduce new processes, as Andy said, right? Or, make things better and have some lessons learned that you take out of this and then apply it to future projects.
Well, let's take it from abstract to a little bit more concrete. I'm curious, we've talked kind of higher level about some good ideas, some good approaches, but, let's take the example where, say, you're parachuting into a project that started 8 months ago, started smoothly, but it's kind of ballooned out of control. You're joining with a team of 3 or 4 others who have been on the project for a long time, and you have a team of 2 or 3 that are joining in, and things are just crazy and chaotic. No one really knows what's going on or what the goal is anymore. Where do you start? What do you do, and how do you get things back on track?
I think going back to what we talked about initially is that you need to just take stock of the situation, right? Understand the goal, understand the scope, state of affairs as it is. And then more importantly, understand your role, right? You want to make sure that you're not stepping on toes. Like if you've been asked to come in and help, make sure that you're helping as a partner and that your help is welcome and that you're respecting others' roles. I think that's really important to know where the roles are, know where the trouble is, and just be adaptable and responsive and focused.
Yeah, I think this is a tough one sometimes, but you need to be willing to have respectful but frank conversations with people on the Expero side and the customer side. Doesn't necessarily mean that'll make something better for sure. But back to the whole point on communication, sometimes, it's easy for people just to maybe somebody else, like Kareem, I think you're saying, doesn't think this thing's dysfunctional at all. It's fine. This is how I do it. Feels good just being a tornado running around all the time. But in most cases, people are very reasonable. And if you have a discussion with them, that may in and of itself help clear things up. If it doesn't, they probably at least have a better understanding of where we're coming from. And it might make it a little bit easier for us to kind of bridge that gap between a dysfunctional area and the functional area and do that out in the open.
Yeah, I think it's important to get the big issues out as quickly as possible as well. Don't sugarcoat them. Like
Right.
if there really is a budget problem, there's a budget problem. Everybody needs to know that, including the sponsors. If there's a communication issue, that's a relatively easy one to fix. You can set up various different meetings and channels and status reports, just to resettle the communication. But get any of the issues that you think are fundamentally undermining the project out as quickly as possible, and then track them, report back on them as they start to get better, or if they don't get better, make sure that's continually raised in a forum where everybody can participate and give good feedback.
I think, Andy, something that you always do really well on your projects is you're transparent about everything. You have that communication. So I think that that's something that's really important. What you're talking about is like being transparent with, if there's a problem, let's just talk about it and let's put it on the table.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because if you don't put something out on the table and 2 weeks goes by, maybe you can recover. If you don't say it again and 4 weeks go by, then it's expanding and growing. So, and the other thing is, if the team is unaware of what the final goal is, I find this a lot on projects where the development team, everything's fine, everything's moving, but the development team really doesn't have a feel for what the bigger picture is. Like, what's the roadmap? What are we trying? This is to Ted's point earlier. What's the real objective that we're trying to get to and deliver on? And keeping the development team up to speed on changes or things that are impacting that from a business perspective or a financial perspective really helps them, think about things in a different light as well.
Yeah, people along those lines in software, not only software development, but software development, every member of the team usually has a very wide kind of latitude as far as how they can execute their job, I think. And that goes all the way from the developer who's, just out of college, all the way up to the PM. We put a lot of trust in the people that are working for us. And so every day they're making hundreds of decisions. And to Andy's point, if they do not have the necessary context, take the person, right out of college, maybe working on, I got a ticket, it came down from the sky, I have a single ticket. Okay, I'm working on my ticket. Great. Usually, hopefully it's more than just, a title on a Jira story, but if you got it from me, that might be it. So you got that, but you don't even know, like, is this a spike? Is this a more production feature? Who's going to, whatever. There's all different dimensions that go into how much time should I spend on this, et cetera, et cetera. Without that information, you're doing your own thing and you're going to make your kind of best guess. So one thing that I find challenging and is important to do, though, is to try to figure out how better to up and down that whole stack, like Andy's saying, communicate the right context, which could be involve Confluence, documentation, or meetings, or whatever the different medium is, to give that necessary context so people can make the right decision, because we are asking them to make hundreds of decisions every week.
Yeah, communication is very key. And oftentimes the reason you are in the state of dysfunction is likely a lack of communication that happened when it needed to, right? If you're parachuting into this, or maybe more likely got pushed off the plane and landed in the spot you are, the first thing is really, survey the land and info gathering, right? That's the first thing you should be doing. You don't want to take over anyone's positions or strip them of their responsibilities. Your job really is go talk to everyone, go talk to them some more, get all the info you can, read the documentation before you start making any decisions, right? And then once you've gathered that info, communicate that to the team, give them the context. Here's what I understood. Here's the status. Does everyone agree? And then from there, you sort of have a common branching off point to now start making decisions to get to the functional from the dysfunction, right? If you arrive at an emergency scene, you first want to know what types of hair on fire stuff you're dealing with, right? Which chemical do you want to use on the fire? You're not just going to jump in and take a pipe and just start spraying it all over the place. You might spread the fire more. You want to use the right tools and the right answers to the job.
Yeah, you have to do your triage, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you've dropped into a project, you've identified areas of dysfunction. Maybe you and a couple other people on the team are aware there's an issue and things need to change, but maybe there are some people on the team that are resistant to change. Or let's say, maybe everyone is aware that, hey, there are things we need to work out here, but you try introducing new methodologies or new tools or new systems to get things going, and it's just not working. Like, you're still hitting brick walls. What do you do in that situation? So whether there's resistance or just like things aren't clicking when you do try to introduce those changes.
I mean, I think that goes back to, well, one, communication, but
Mhm.
it's more of addressing those in smaller bits and pieces, right? So it's not coming and saying, okay, everyone, we've changed it. We're going to be breaking down the work this way. We're going to be using this tool, and you have to do it this way, right? So I think it's very much of, we've found the problem, we've addressed the problem, or we've gone back to the statement of work, we're mapping it back one for one. This is how we need to deliver things. And then you just take it baby steps almost. That's a for lack of a better term. And just meeting with the team. You know, it's, if you have to have 5 meetings a day, have 5 meetings a day. Or if you need to meet with one person at a time, then do it that way until you get consensus. I think that, you know, for the most part, people aren't resistant to change for the better. You know, they want things to be better, so they'll be eager to help work it out. People we have here, it's like, oh, let's make it better. What do we need to do? Like, you know, jump on the wagon. So
most people know when
yeah,
there's
they know.
well, if you're in a project that's dysfunctional, you know it's dysfunctional. And so most people are willing to, move and change and try different things. And so collectively, the team moves it along. And if you do have individuals that still want to fall outside of that, you can, if it gets really bad, you can address the individual issue. But for the most part, the team will kind of force everybody into the right pattern, as long as the proposals, make sense and everyone's buying into it, which, for the most part, people do.
I think kind of like Kareem said earlier about, people have different definitions of dysfunction. It's important when you're talking to stakeholders to sometimes communicate in terms of kind of where the dysfunction is affecting them specifically from. Maybe they're not giving you great requirements or something like that. And you're like, man, this is just a problem. We can't keep our backlog full, et cetera, et cetera. You tell a non-software development person, you start talking about backlogs and stuff, they're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But if you put it in terms like, oh, you're supposed to go present at a conference in 2 weeks and do a demo, there's no way that's happening. Like, there's always an underlying kind of physics of any project. There's a fixed amount of people, at least within any particular time. There's only so much that can be done. And no matter how you beat around the bush, like, you're only get done what you can get done in that amount of time. And so I think it's important to just make sure you're putting things in terms that the other person's going to care about. They might not care about the particular thing that you care about or be affected about it in the same way, but they will be affected by it some way. So
yeah, you need to know who your audience is that you're talking to and how to get their buy-in to what you're trying to get across. Because like you said, you're going to use different words and talk about different parts of the system to a developer than you would to someone who's leading the business. And knowing your audience is really important in having those conversations and getting your point across in a way that they understand. I think sometimes it's also helping them to learn what some of the software development process is like and how it works. If they don't have a lot of experience with that or aren't very familiar with it, then they don't necessarily have the same mental framework around, this is usually how things go, or we've got these 2 steps. Well, we need to insert 3 more steps in here. This is what they typically look like. And here's where it benefits you, audience member that I'm talking to.
yeah, that's a really good point. I think educating stakeholders that maybe haven't been exposed to software development before. If you just think like, oh, it's like building a house or something. Well, I guess on a certain level. But I feel like there's ways that we can help folks build up a little bit better mental model around that. And then I think it's easier for them and probably more pleasant for them to work with us.
I agree. Sometimes just letting them know what the limits are and why, right? They see software as this sort of this virtual thing, right? You can change course in a whim, and with the house you can't. But with software, oh yeah, it's a software. You can do whatever, right? You can change on a moment's notice. And sometimes you then suffer from senior managers just doing flybys, right? They're giving you direction every which way, and there's a lot of interruptions. It throws the team off because then they lose their momentum, and too much of that, and you end up just thrashing, right? you're sort of turning your head every which way and swirling, but not really making any progress. And then you sort of in this tornado where it's not really going anywhere, and things are getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think intuition doesn't always work in the software case. So you could, so a stakeholder says, I want this screen to look totally different, different colors. It's only front end change. Takes a week or something. Then they come back and they say, we need to add this one number onto this report. And it turns out you're like, that's going to take 6 months. They're like, what? It's one number. Well, there's a lot underneath the covers there. So it's that sort of education, I think, that's important. And explaining your process as you're going through it. So you're being transparent and building up trust, I think, because I think another reason dysfunction can arise is if, you just don't have that trust due to communication or whatever that's in place.
That's a big one, Ted, is the trust.
Yeah.
And the trust of the stakeholders and the decision makers, which could be two completely different people or teams.
Yeah. Without kind of like a mutual respect and trust, which not saying that needs to just be automatically there day one, especially when you're working with somebody new. But if you can't get to that where somebody can kind of offload some of that decision making even onto us, knowing that we are all working towards the same thing, it can become just very difficult to communicate.
I think it's really important to celebrate the wins. And even within a project that might be a little more chaotic than the next, there's always a win in a project. So, I think we talked about earlier is like small wins are still wins. And so I want to be mindful of teams when people think, oh, this is just going down the wrong way, but there's still successes within the project. And then I always welcome help if someone's coming to help on a project, or if someone needs help, I'm always willing to give it, or, bring a different perspective on that project.
Yeah, that's a lot like building the team culture. If you've got a set of processes and everyone's bought into it and everyone's working towards it and everyone's encouraged to participate, it naturally builds trust, which was mentioned earlier, and can lead to a much more productive environment. If communication is poor and everyone's just off in their corners without that sharing, it can be very hard to keep people on track. So I think that's a very important thing to build. Openness and trust across the team, no matter what level. It doesn't matter if it's the junior programmer to the senior leader. That participation has to be engaging and positive as much as you can make it.
Yeah, I think just getting folks in the habit of a continuous improvement mindset, whether the project's dysfunctional or not, which I see just very commonly as people are always coming up with new ideas to make things better. And maybe the only difference on a particularly dysfunctional project is kind of maybe the magnitude of change that perhaps needs to happen. But really it's kind of the same thing, I think.
Once you find yourself in the middle of a situation and, you feel overwhelmed because it's like, how are you going to get through this? Pam said it earlier, but you just take it, a step at a time instead of trying to tackle the whole staircase at once, right? It's like, what's the next step I do? What's the next step I do? Okay, now after that, let's evaluate and then judge the next step we want to do. And so once you're past that denial where, hey, I am, not in a dysfunctional situation, and you accept that, yes, this is dysfunctional, then, just take it small pieces of action at a time.
Thanks for connecting with us today. If you have a complex software problem that needs solving, thoughts on what we discussed today, or ideas on what topics we should tackle next, feel free to reach out to us at podcast@experoinc.com or on Twitter @experoinc. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you next time.